Well, welcome everyone. I want to welcome you to today's School of Education Research Symposium session. My name is Jennifer Coran. I am the Research and Grants Coordinator for the School of Education. And it's my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. Today, our meeting is graced with the attendance of Dan Robinson. Dan Robinson is the K-16 Mind, Brain, and Education Endowed Chair and Associate Dean of Research. I couldn't quite fit everything on the flyer, so I hope you'll excuse me. Also Associate Dean of Research at the University of Texas at Arlington. And like a lot of our presenters, he's got a very extensive CV. So I just wanted to point out that he is the co-editor of the IAP volume from 2019, Misinformation and Fake News in Education, and also the author of the chapter we're discussing today on educational quackery. And today's topic is pseudoscience in education. So this is intended to be a very interactive session. So feel free to contribute with your comments and your questions. This is a little bit less of a lecture format for today's session, okay? Welcome so much, Dan Robinson.
Thank you. I think when you have a title or email signature that gets very, very long, you can tell that your career is coming to a close the longer that title gets. So that's a reminder every day. So thanks for having me. I only recognize one person. I think that may be your dean, Cecil Smith, who I've known for quite a few years. So thanks for having me, and appreciate you. Thinking about why attendance might not be high today. The title of the chapter that you read, Quackery in Education Research, that title has gotten me into so much trouble in terms of, I did this stuff about 10 years ago, and I started going around doing a few talks at different places. And if I had quackery in educational research in the title, I noticed before I even arrived, if they would announce and advertise my talk, I would find out that there were faculty and sometimes students who were complaining and protesting about bringing me in as a speaker. They were attempting to cancel me before I ever began to speak. And I'm not sure what that was, but some people are terrified of the word quackery and thought I was going to be directing my meanness at them, so to speak. And I thought they were pretty misguided in terms of that. But anyway, regardless, thanks for attending, even though I had quackery in my title today. So that shows that you're either not afraid or you came armed with tomatoes. You could throw those virtually at a Zoom screen, right? Yeah. So anyway, I'm happy to address questions, things like that. I don't know if you wanted me to say any opening remarks about the chapter. I mean, that's pretty boring. It's like going to a dissertation defense and having the candidate present for a half hour first. We've all read it. Let's jump right into the questions.
Well, we'll give it a few minutes here for some questions, but if there aren't, we might have to have you give us the Cliff Notes version. I know at least one person in the audience here private messaged me in the background here as the Zoom host and said, "I'm so sorry I didn't do the homework for today."
It's like a book club meeting where no one's read the book. Those can be kind of boring. A couple of students from the University of Texas at Arlington are also joining. If you see any unfamiliar faces here, I told them about this, and I think they just came to sneer and make remarks and things like that. So, but anyway, I'll start off. I wrote this chapter with Joel Levin, who is one of my collaborators, colleagues, mentors from many years back, even back when I was a grad student, and we were going to Midwest Educational Research Association, where I first met Cecil, probably over 30 years ago. And so Joel and I were talking a lot, talking about, something to write. And I had just taken that dive or walk the plank, so to speak, into administration about 10 years ago. And my empirical research came to a halt. And so like most people who don't do empirical research, I needed to start to write opinion pieces and things based totally on, my knowledge and experiences. So we endeavored to write this chapter, which again, we just wanted to talk about things we saw happening in education and parallels in other fields. And we just kind of wanted people to be aware that sometimes this occurs in our field. It wasn't aimed at any particular methodology. I think, some folks who have a qualitative interest and background thought that, well, obviously he's aiming this at qualitative folks. Absolutely not. Nothing in our writings aimed at the methodology war or anything like that. We just mainly we're talking about people who were coming up with stuff and recommendations that weren't really backed by the evidence. And a lot of this was the correlation into causation sort of trick that a lot of people pull. They'll tell you in an article that, we're doing a correlational study. They'll start off with limitations and they'll say, of course, this is a correlational study, so we cannot, infer causality. And then a paragraph later, they'll go into 3 or 4 recommendations for practice based on their results. So that was really kind of the audience that we were aiming at here. And I'll tell you, I'm working with some colleagues right now on updating some of our earlier studies where we looked at trends in educational research and we looked at, declines in experimental research and increases in more correlational observational research. Then we found that, more people were making these sort of recommendations for practice or prescriptive statements. And then we found later that it was mainly due to causal modeling. People were using HLM, SEM, path analysis, mediation, moderation analyses, whatever you call it, but they were doing this with existing databases, ex post facto data. And then they were coming up with recommendations for practice. And right now we're updating this. We'll probably present at AERA a year from now on this, but so far the data looks like it's not getting any better. It's actually getting worse in terms of people making recommendations for practice without their data really supporting those recommendations. Now, that may be an argument we want to get in today. Maybe some of you do lots of correlational analyses and say, it's totally appropriate to make recommendations for practice. Joel and I even wrote an article saying it's not really appropriate to make recommendations for practice when you do experimental research. We did that 10 years ago because we thought, one single study, that's probably not enough convincing data to be making recommendations for practice, even if you do randomized experiments. So it's not like we're saying that we have a halo and we're the only ones who can do this. We're saying you need more evidence than that. So we're pretty conservative in that regard. So, okay, have I bought people enough time to come up with some witty question? Cecil, do you want to go into a 20-minute speech? And don't talk about my personal qualities. Talk more about the issue at hand.
I need a couple of hours to talk about your personal qualities or lack thereof, my friend. I note in your chapter, as I'm skimming it here, I apologize, I didn't do the homework either. I don't really have an excuse. I suppose I could use my dog, say that he ate my homework, but he did not. So I won't throw him under the bus. So you talk about the U.S. Department of Education's What Works Clearinghouse. And a colleague some years ago who said the single defining characteristic about the What Works Clearinghouse is that nothing works in regards to the various programs and interventions that were listed on that clearinghouse at that time. What's your impression? What's your takeaway about the value, the utility of the What Works Clearinghouse for practitioners?
Yeah, I think you sort of nailed it. I've heard it called the What Doesn't Work Clearinghouse because they have so few studies meet their gold standard for evidence that it's frustrating for 95% of everybody who has something reviewed by them. So I think most of us would agree that What Works Clearinghouse is probably perhaps a little too draconian in terms of their standards. But then again, I'm the same person that wrote an article saying that we shouldn't be making recommendations based on one study, one article. We should probably be, gathering cumulative evidence that's convincing before we make definitive statements about here's what teachers should do, here's what principals should do, and so on. So, the problem with that is, and many people who I very much respect have told me, Dan, in the absence of anything, we have to come up with something. So, the teachers want recommendations. We want to know what to do and so on. So in the absence of convincing data, we have to produce something. One of the things you're seeing right now in a lot of journals, and especially in the area of educational psychology, which is what I thought was my field, Journal of Educational Psychology and Contemporary Educational Psychology both have practical implications sections now, and they're making authors do that. And so when they get to that point, I think the editors and publishers are almost pushing people, pressuring people to say, hey, tell us how this informs work in the classroom. Teachers want to know how's your study going to help them? And so even if you don't really have convincing data to say, I think teachers should do this, you're sort of being forced to say something. And that's not good either. So there's this two opposing sides. One, very conservative scientists who say, hey, look, we did a study, but I'm not comfortable going this far. And then on the other hand, you have this pressure from publishers like, hey, we want the most hits, we want the most downloads. We've got to sell journals, we've got to sell downloads. Please put some stuff out there that's very newsworthy and headline worthy. And so those two battling forces are causing some problems, I think, if what we end up recommending is based on flimsy evidence, and it could backfire or even hurt educational practice.
So you're really, in this chapter, you're really taking aim at recommendations for practice. You're not necessarily criticizing the educational research endeavor in general, but really providing a critique on and causing us to question, what is the basis for recommendations for practice in education?
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Jennifer. It's kind of like if I'm standing out in the street talking to my neighbor, drinking a can of beer, like that old that cartoon. Forget the name, but the guy stood out there and did that. Anyway, somebody might ask, what do you put on your lawn to make it so nice and get rid of your weeds or whatever? And you might say something like, well, I use this product or whatever. And that's one thing, saying, like, here's what I found in my little study. Here's what the conclusions were. But when you go further and you say, I think everyone should do this. I think you should use this. I recommend, that's sort of going beyond. And it's kind of like if you went to the doctor's office and said, I've got a swollen knee. What should I do for it? The doctor's probably going to tell you to do something. Take this medication, do these exercises, something like that. Those are prescriptions for, what you should be doing. And you want those based on some evidence. Just like if a mechanic tells you like, hey, your car's doing this, you need to do more of this and less of this. You'd like to think that maybe he or she has some expertise and that that won't end up causing any damage. We should be doing the same thing in education. If we have expertise, we should be using it carefully and wisely and not sort of erratically, just because someone sticks a microphone in our face.
So there probably all manner of, I know there are all manner of programs and practices and interventions that don't have a lot of, or maybe any empirical support for them. Nonetheless, teachers, practitioners adopt and use these programs, practices, and interventions pretty widely. Do we have some evidence of harm?
Well, that's a good question in terms of real harm. I think if you're pushing a particular treatment and encouraging that in the absence of something that might work, then that's probably going to be a bit harmful. Think of the facilitated communication with autistic kids.
I was just thinking of that, Dan.
if you're pushing that and saying this is working and it's actually a big farce, and instead those kids could have been spending some time, getting some decent therapy, some exercises, working on some skills that may actually help them, then yeah, that's kind of where there's kind of like a cancer treatment that doesn't work while your cancer continues to grow. That's probably not very good. So yeah, but we don't see too much life or death stuff going on in education. Now, if you look at educational reform efforts over the last 50 plus years since, Johnson Elementary and Secondary Education Act, we've been trying to battle the effects of poverty, the troubling patterns of race differences in education. And if you look at the data, if you look at the achievement gap in terms of standard deviation units from 1965 up until now, it's about the same. So whatever they've been trying, it hasn't worked. And they've spent not millions, not billions, but trillions of dollars on educational reform efforts. And they don't work. And every year we hear politicians say our schools are broken, our educational system's broken. We need to do this. We need to make more charter schools. We need to create more school choice. We need to do this, this, and this. And none of it works. So we sit there and listen to complete nonsense, and we continue to believe these folks. And I'm just wondering, how much longer will the parade go along where the emperor walks by naked, where no one's going to say anything, instead of all admiring how beautiful the clothes are and spend more and more trillions of dollars? Because we've been lied to over the years. Nothing has fixed the achievement gap problem. If they found something that worked, we'd be using it. It's sort of like a drug that cures cancer. If there was one out there, we'd be using it because it would be proven effective. We don't have that in educational reform. All right, does that open up some discussion? At least some of you should be passionate about your field, education, and what works and what doesn't.
Yes, we have a question from Jayshi. Jayshi, go ahead with your question.
Hi, so I am a second-year PhD student doing concentrating in math education, and from the discussion that we're just going on, it makes me thinking about one of the big questions that I've always had when I'm reading my field articles. My background is I have been doing about a year of observation at a rural middle high school on how teachers teach math. And I also was a graduate assistant teaching the entry-level math class for about 2 to 3 years before I started my PhD. So with all of this similar background, when I'm reading research articles, I always see this huge movement on, I'm not sure if you're familiar with procedural and conceptual math, where procedure just more of the steps, algorithms on how to do math. And then concepts is they push on higher order thinking in mathematics, where you have to understand what you're doing. So there's a lot of push into this conceptual math thinking. And then when I'm going back to rural middle school and observe, teachers often comment, they don't think the people who design the curriculum understand how to teach a class, because there's so much into higher order thinking, and there's so many supposedly good research proving that it works. But then when you go back to really observing classes, there's just too many teachers complaining and talking about how they struggle with following the curriculums, not having enough support on that. And I want to do as in at least a thesis study that is meaningful to me. So I'm actually going into this direction, but there's so much struggle into it because sometimes I feel like I'm solving a word problem that I'm not capable of. So I wonder, what are your, some ideas or thinking about that?
Yeah, you've hit on a problem that would probably take hours, much like Cecil talking about my personality deficits. We would need a lot more time. The whole transition from research into practice is fraught with stumbling blocks along the way, and teachers are more of the boots on the ground. They know the kids, they know the unique challenges, they know a lot more than the researcher in the lab. but the researcher in the lab at the same time is able to compare a number of different approaches, all things controlled, that might be effective. So, we should be treating professional development as more of a possible tool that you might want to use, as opposed to a prescribed practice. And think of all of the teacher lives out there that have been not destroyed, but at least hurt in terms of having to sit through painful professional development trainings because some administrator thought, hey, this new flavor of the month educational fad seems to be what we should be doing. So let's all spend a lot of time and force feed our teachers and make them do this. And the teachers, don't relate to it, or even if they do, it doesn't work as promised. So we need to rethink a lot of what we're doing in terms of trying to translate research into practice. I don't think the way we're doing it right now is working very well. Just about every teacher I talk to has had it up to here with professional development, and even in teacher education programs. If you look at the syllabi, and I've looked at University of Texas at Arlington and found horrible things, but I would guess that even if you looked at Southern Illinois University, at every class that's taught in teacher education, we might find a few things that are being taught that aren't necessarily shown to be effective research-wise. So we have a lot of cleaning up to do. Maybe that's what your dissertation should be, the cleaning up efforts, as opposed to coming up with yet another, this is now the perfect way to teach math. We've been trying that for years. We haven't found it yet.
Dan, you touched on an issue that I think is really critical, that of teachers being required to participate in professional development, and those professional development programs and offerings are usually determined by school administrators, principals, sometimes superintendents. And as you well know, there are a lot of hucksters and snake oil sales associates out there peddling all kinds of professional development practices and so on. I think one of the worst offenders is Ruby Payne, a very well-known name. There are others, of course, maybe not quite so well-known or notorious. But we talk a lot about, educating teachers, but we also need to educate our school administrators as they are preparing for the portion of their education career involving administration of schools and districts. I think that's where we're often missing the boat.
Well, take it a step further. You and I both, Cecil, have looked at and sort of gone down that road of leadership in higher education over the last part of our career. And I have attended, workshops for department chairs. I have attended trainings to be a dean. And obviously with an educational psychology background, I come into that thinking, well, I'm going to be exposed to a whole new world of research because I've never studied educational administration, educational leadership. I'm ready to dive in and find out what works and what's effective. And instead, it's sort of like going to watching a naturopath, movie advertisement on, let's take shark cartilage and all of your pain will go away. I was appalled with the lack of science that's informing what we do in higher education in terms of leadership. And so if we don't have it in higher education, what do we have in terms of K-12 administration for principal certification? Our principal certification talks about learning styles and superintendent training and things like that. We got a lot of cleaning up to do. And I guess, if there's one take-home message today that I would like to leave you with is, what's your responsibility in cleaning things up? You're in the field, so to speak. And do you want to be one of those people clapping and yelling and voicing your support when yet another educational fad parades by, or the university where you work They decide to spend several million on a new software package that's supposed to be fantastic and so on with no research evidence whatsoever. We sit by and we say, oh, okay, sure. Look, let's all move from Blackboard to Canvas. Let's all go from this accreditation agency to this one because it's going to be so much better. Yet it will cost us 5 years just in the transition of figuring everything out. But because some provost or president thought that that's the best way to go, then we should all do that. And so we're similar in higher education, I think, to teachers and principals who are somewhat pawn-like in the education system when we have things forced on us that just really are sort of ridiculous to even begin with. We just had a new time sheet keeping software that was forced on us at UT Arlington. And everybody's like, Dan, did you go in? Did you sign up? Did you get everything ready? You won't get paid without it. I said, you know what? I haven't been filling out a timesheet here for the last 5 years and I've gotten every check. So I'm not going to do this. And then when they rolled it out on April 1st, guess what? Whole bunch of bugs, complete disaster. Nothing worked. Nobody could get it to work. They're still working on it 2 weeks later. Yet we spent a whole bunch of money on that. So, we need to have people who stand up and say, we're part of this community. We need to call BS when we see it and not have fear of losing our jobs. And I think that's the only thing that people like Cecil and me and some of the rest of you who have this thing called tenure, let's hope that tenure isn't taken away from us, because tenure is the only thing that protects me enough where I can write a chapter like this and not lose my job. Sure, I can be canceled at other universities before I even get there because quackery is in the title of my talk. They can cancel me even though I have tenure, but they can't fire me from my job for pursuing something academically that, isn't downright racist, isn't, hurtful to a particular group of people. I'm calling bull on everyone. I'm not targeting any individuals. I'm saying we all need to be better. I'm not targeting any specific group.
We have a question from Dr. Bacon.
Hey, thank you, Dr. Robinson. I joined a little late, so my apologies. I'm just wondering what you think about improving practice through practitioner research. It's not a top-down typical educational research. It's more bottom up, grassroots. But for me, I have been doing practitioner research since I was a master's student. And for me, it has, and not only in my own practice, which I'm still engaged in practitioner research as tenured faculty, but for all the teachers, the early childhood teachers, family services, parent educators, elementary and secondary teachers, and even doc students who have taken a practitioner research course, I've noticed real shifts in practice that impact those classrooms, those students, those practitioners. And when we support our students and help them publish, then I do believe that gets out into the academic journals, because more and more research, more and more journals are publishing practitioner research. And I feel like that can begin to have that ripple effect and make a difference. And I guess I want to know what your thoughts are.
Well, I confess I'm not a trained participant, practicing researcher, or as we used to call it back in the day, action researcher. Is that kind of what you're, yeah.
Well, yeah, because when we think about action research, right, it has different flavors. Because action research can be used in business, nursing, many different domains, but practitioner research is, or teacher research is specifically applicable to education.
Yeah.
And so, P20 education.
Yeah. So I think any of us who teach, even at the university level, we would be liars if we said we didn't engage in so-called practitioner research, because every time I teach a course, I try some things, I try some new things, and I tweak it the next time around. I change my syllabus, I change up what I'm doing. I try to get rid of things that didn't work very well, and I try to expand on things that work better. So we're all practitioner researchers in a sense if we take that approach to our teaching. Now, how we find a way to safely make recommendations for practice based on that practitioner research can be a little more challenging. So, we don't want to abuse that by saying, hey, here's what I did in my class, I recommend everyone should do that.
Right.
That's a strong prescription. But I don't think there's anything wrong with certain journals who identify themselves as practitioner research and say, you know what, don't read this journal as if it's a medical journal or something like that with hard prescriptions. These are more ideas. These are more things you might wish to try out and see if, and they're safe things to try out where we don't think there's a lot of danger in terms of trying this out. And then I think that's perfectly fine, but we have to kind of be careful in terms of how we package our recommendations. Was this based on a, just like in medicine, was this based on a controlled randomized clinical trial? Did it show that the vaccine has no serious side effects that could hurt people overall? And was there evidence that it is effective at dealing with the virus? We want those types of studies. Same way in education, if we're going to come up with something that's really a hard prescriptive and say, my God, I think all schools should do this, we want to make sure we have strong backing behind that. But there's absolutely nothing wrong with having a particular journal or outlet where we can say, hey, these are real teachers on the ground doing the dirty work that we all speak about. And here's something that they tried out. You may wish to try it. And here's what they found.
Yeah, I agree. But I think there's this notion of like the practitioner research that we all do informally, that we do without really thinking about it. And then there's that systematic practitioner research where we're following some basic guidelines, empirical guidelines that have been established. And we have IRB approval. And we're conducting that research with IRB approval, and our implications become more thoughtful. And there are really top right now. There are top ranked research journals that are publishing practitioner research. But ensuring through that blind peer review process that the researchers have conducted ethical research, they've outlined their positionality clearly, and their recommendations are not, you must do that, but this is something that worked in my setting with my population. Here it is. And what might be something you do to continue this conversation, to continue this thought?
Yeah, I think I've dealt with something similar. I like to do experimental research in real classrooms, because sometimes if we just use laboratory settings, it's the students aren't as motivated, they're not doing it for their grade and so on. So I've done a lot of the crossover design research where we introduce an innovation or intervention in a real classroom, and then we halfway through we make sure everyone gets equal exposure to the intervention. So I'm big in favor of that, which it's just moving along the continuum more towards practitioner-based research. But I think in addition, like ethical standards, IRB, things like that, there has to be a discussion of internal validity and the rigor in terms of internal validity, in terms of, can we conclude that these results were due to the treatment and the treatment only and things like that, So I don't know if we're going to settle that debate today, Heidi.
We probably won't. I think we're coming from two different spaces.
Yeah.
But I would argue that one of the top researchers in my field recently, within the last 2 years, published a paper looking at meta-synthesis of literature. And when we have enough of these studies that have similar results in similar settings, we can begin then to think about generalizability.
Yeah, I think that's good. I'd like to see that continued, because I think action research had kind of a not so great name even 30 years ago when I was, first starting out. And I remember reviewing proposals for AERA for the action research SIG way back then. And I didn't have a good understanding of it. I came out of a very much experimental background. And I just thought, like, what is this? What's this supposed to be? And so on. So we have to do a better job of kind of, communicating across methods, across fields better, so that folks have a better understanding of our research. Even within a college or school of education, we are evaluated by our peers, annual review, merit, promotion, tenure, things like that. And most of the problems, I think, occur when we're asked to review somebody where we're very not familiar with their field and what they do, and how rigorous that might be, and how valued that might be. How good is this journal, so to speak, and those are things that we struggle with at Texas Arlington. I'm sure you're struggling with the same thing.
We do too.
Yeah.
So I just want to bring up one more point, and then I'll step back and we can hear from others. But I love the fact that you introduced this notion of design-based research, because design-based research has that practitioner component woven into it, but it takes practitioner research into a whole new direction. And it's really exciting, because I think design-based research, and I have a couple of colleagues here at SIU who are very interested in it and are pursuing it. I really think it's underutilized in P20 educational research.
I remember when Ann Brown first started writing about design-based research, over 20 years ago, and it was supposed to be this, really ingenious thing that it was an iterative process. And I remember thinking, like, well, experimental researchers also use a very iterative process. We do multiple experiments and we change things along the way. So there's a lot of miscommunication and need for communication among researchers that we need to improve on. So I really appreciate you sharing that, Heidi. Thank you.
Dr. Robinson, I have a question. So I teach research methods. I'm a quantitative methodologist. I teach research methods to doctoral students. And maybe it's because I'm just working on preparing kind of like the final lesson for the semester, and it's on writing discussion sections. And the literature I'm working off of is actually from some linguists up at University of Michigan, Michigan State. They're up in Michigan, and they study academic writing. So they're looking at patterns in academic writing discourse and things like that. And so I'm using that as guidance on how to write a discussion section. But, it occurred to me from what you've said, do you know of any, because of course the recommendations for practice always come in the discussion section. That's about how we write the discussion section. Do you know of any, like taxonomies for how we should write discussion sections as scholars? Guidance about, like, you should only include this in your discussion section if your design had that, or something like that along those lines?
The APA style manual used to be pretty prescriptive in terms of, recommendations for writing particular sections and things like that. So that's about the only one I know of. And it's funny because as an associate dean of research, I do workshops here occasionally, just designed to try to help mainly our newer faculty. So I'm doing one in a couple of weeks titled "How to Write a Manuscript," a research manuscript, which sounds arrogant, I guess, like I'm the author on that or something, but all we can go by is our personal experiences. And I used to think, there was a definite way to do it, Jennifer, because 20, 30 years ago, I sound like not only do I look like an old guy, I sound like an old guy now. Back in the day, we were taught not to go beyond our data and to restrict whatever we said in the discussion section. Make darn sure that that's tied directly to your findings. And I used to, as a young researcher, I occasionally would mess up, and editors or reviewers would say, hey, look, this paragraph or this sentence here, that's kind of going beyond your data. You need to revise that. Well, now it seems like the opposite is happening. I'll try to write in a rather conservative fashion and not go beyond my data. And then I have editors saying, I'd like you to speculate more on that. Could you speculate a little bit more right here? Speculate. Are we supposed to do that in research articles? Are we supposed to speculate? I mean, where does speculation belong? So if that's happening these days, then my recommendations or my taxonomy for how to write a discussion section is not going to be consistent with today's discussion sections. I mean, I'm an old grumpy guy. I think people should go back to not going beyond their data, but that's just me and Cecil. You know, the rest of you may think differently.
Well, it's interesting.
Maybe we should have every article should have a box, right? There's a box clearly delineated that says speculation or speculative ideas, or take this for what it's worth, and list some bullet points, right?
You could
Well-
put the little BS icon thing there. You
Yeah.
know, looks like chocolate soft serve ice cream. You could just put that right at the beginning.
Yeah.
Dr. Robinson, I have to tell you, I give that same advice to my doctoral students because we tend to oftentimes have some generalizations that really stray that we can't put out there. But I just want to let you know that there's a whole new field of study in qualitative research that's pushing the boundaries called speculative research and education. So it's actually kind of exciting research, but it's out there, and there's a workshop coming up on it this Saturday the 30th. So
It's sort of the corollary is voodoo economics.
ugh.
Well, getting back to what I was kind of getting at with my question, you know, we had a speaker come in last semester, a couple of speakers come in to talk about authorship, and now there's getting to be some taxonomies for how you break down contributions to publications. And we didn't really need a taxonomy back in the day until there were disagreements and you know, a lot of diversity in terms of, you know, ghostwriters and, you know, and all of that came in. And now some folks are developing some taxonomies to clarify that. And, you know, the APA publication manual, you know, they are prescriptive about what goes in what section and what tends to use in what section. But I don't think it's very prescriptive about, you know, what can be said based on in the discussion section based on what level of, you know, what methods or level of research or kind of how far along the research is. So I haven't seen any sort of taxonomy for to guide researchers, and especially to help guide and rein in journal editors in terms of what the standards are for what goes in a discussion section and when and how that's appropriate.
Unfortunately, we rely on expertise in our field in terms of reviewers and editors to be the gatekeepers there and make sure that we are sticking to our data, but sometimes that does not occur. It's funny you mentioned contributions. You know, about 15 years ago, I think I was still an associate professor, maybe I was still an assistant professor. I decided I was going to be last author on anything I wrote with grad students, just because they needed the authorship order more than me. And that's something I've sort of stuck to whenever I've worked with doctoral students. I usually try to be the last author, but we found in terms of looking at, you know, productive authors out there that a lot of times folks would not. And a lot of times folks would not publish with grad students, or they certainly would never have them as first author, which is an important thing to consider, I think, if you're considering graduate school. I know that my colleagues at Georgia Southern, they have an actual written policy at their institution where higher up in the authorship you are, the more credit you get. It's sort of like the point system we use to award authorship credit for productivity studies. I hope we don't get to that point. When I was at University of Texas, Austin, I would have to put down in parentheses after each of my references for my publications, what my contribution was. So it'd either be like 90% or 10% or something like that, you know, and then you couldn't have a bunch of authors at the same institution totaling over 100%. So that was interesting too. But, one of the things we're seeing in our field, speaking of all these studies we do looking at the field, is we see that the average number of authors per article has gone up tremendously since the 1970s. The encouraging part of that would be our field is becoming more collaborative. And the more eyes, the more perspectives you get in a research study, hopefully the better it is. But the depressing part of that, if there's any truth to this, is that we're sticking names on and we're adding more and more people and things like that, because we're still in the publish versus perish mindset at research one, institutions.
So Dan, on that note, as I well know, you've done a lot of these bibliometric studies, calculating publication rates, authors' contributions to published articles, and so on and so forth. And I know you've had many conversations with our colleagues around the country. Have you encountered folks who've admitted to padding the number of authors on their manuscripts, on their published papers?
No one has admitted it. There was a study a few years back. I don't know if you remember, but there were 3 special education researchers. A couple of them were my friends. I'd worked with them at the University of Texas at Austin, but they had worked with a few people from Australia, Tasmania, New Zealand, and they did some digging, and they found that these folks were all including each other on as authors, and they would submit papers to each other's journals where they were serving as editor. And sometimes the length of time between submission and acceptance was less than 1 day.
Wow.
So they kind of exposed that going on in a field. And I would bet my career that certainly goes on among some people, because we're like anybody who is forced to play by certain rules. We push the boundaries of those rules, and if there's a way to cheat and get away with it and be rewarded for that, that's human nature to try to do that. So I would imagine some of that occurs in some places. So I'd like to think by my policy of being a last author, I'm less likely to be tempted by that kind of stuff, but it doesn't completely absolve me of anything like that.
I always thought you let me be the senior author, so I'd take the blame for any errors.
And I like your term bibliometric. You always called those BS studies. Maybe that was short.
Indeed.
Any other questions, comments? This is probably one of your more controversial topic days, I would imagine. And it's the thing I want to say about this is having a cordial, civil conversation like this today about something that's controversial represents the best of what universities and academia have to offer. And if we can do this, if Heidi and I can talk about participatory research and in a civil way and things like that, I mean, that's what we need to do. And attempting to cancel people because you're afraid of what they might say is not a good thing in academia. Obviously, you don't want a person wearing a Nazi emblem to come to your university and give a guest speech. We need to cancel those types of folks. But we need to be a little bit open, I think, in academia to listening to other perspectives, even though coming in, you're going to hate what this person says. But this should be the safest place in the entire world for us to, air our differences and discuss them in a respectful manner. I see a hand up, Peter.
Yeah, hey Dan. Thanks for joining us today. It's been really fun listening to this discussion. I guess I'm thinking when I saw the title of the talk or the book chapter, I was thinking too about kind of sort of the history of how quack has been used and just how there's famous instances throughout history of people that are dismissed as quacks, and then I think through scientific further research, technological innovation, et cetera, they're kind of redeemed in a way. So I guess I'm just wondering if you could talk a little more about sort of that tension in the scientific method, the inherent presence of uncertainty and reflexivity, and then the tension there of and maybe you could kind of talk more about this kind of what I maybe understand to be your desire for more of a research that is that is rigorous and able to prove of a certain validity that can be prescriptive to a certain degree, similar to like the field of medicine or something like you kind of talked about. So that, I mean, there's a tension there, right? In terms of like any prescription is inevitably, going to be revised, hopefully, and seen critically through its author's eyes, through further study. I hope that's clear. Could you just talk more about kind of that tension there?
Yeah, and those are good thoughts, Peter. I think when you write something, you want to write it and use a title and use terminology that will interest people, that will catch people's attention. Everyone wants people to read our work. We want our work to be interesting and reach the right people. And in hindsight, choosing the word quackery wasn't a good idea for me here, because I certainly didn't want to risk offending people who I did not mean to offend. I mean to stir things up. Stirring things up is different than having people feel like they're being targeted and attacked personally. And I think maybe I would use pseudoscience or some less offensive term if I were to do it all over again. And we have a lot of tension in academia, right? Like I mentioned, in terms of annual reviews, merit, promotion, tenure. It's one of the few fields where we're forced to self-promote. And self-promotion for many of us is not a very comfortable thing, because we know people who self-promote and we call them jerks, right? People who naturally and love to self-promote. We normally don't like to associate with folks like that. Yet we're forced to do that. We're forced to defend what we do, and we critique each other, which can be uncomfortable. But the great thing about academia too is, and the great thing about science is, we need to do that. We need to read each other's work with a skeptical eye. We need to not be just all loving, all embracing all the time. It's okay to be cordial and deeply care about colleagues and not get personal, things like that. But at the same time, if we're in a seminar or whatever, and Cecil's written his latest piece of work and shares it with us, I've got to feel like I can say, hey, I really disagree with this. I don't like the way you put this or something, or I don't think, this is the right thing, and not fear of reprisal because he's my dean, or not fear like, well, we aren't going to be friends anymore because I disagreed with him. We've got to have that, I don't want to say thick skin because that's overused, but we've got to have that air of we're open to critique, honest critique, and critique that is well-intentioned. Because if we don't have that, if we lose that, then we lose, the system of science and the wonderful part of academia that drew me to the profession over 30 years ago, and probably drew many of you. I really love engaging conversation. I love, if I present to a group like this, I want people to challenge me. I certainly don't want people to say, oh, thanks, Dr. Robinson, I really enjoyed your piece. It really spoke to me, and that's nice. But I benefit mostly from, someone like Heidi or Peter or Cecil saying, well, I loved everything except this. I certainly don't agree with this. I wish you would have said this better, or I completely disagree. And that's where we start to, grow as scientists, when people point out our imperfections, our flaws, when and getting back to, how we move things forward, I think we need to be more open to that. Sometimes, we're just a knee-jerk reaction today of, oh my goodness, somebody wrote the wrong thing, used the wrong term, said this, did that, and granted, some of those are absolutely deserved if people are being complete jerks. But sometimes I think we're a little bit too much in a rush to judge and, crucify people undeservedly if they, said the wrong thing or did something wrong. So I'm asking for a kinder, gentler, but still skeptical academic community.
Yeah. For what it's worth, I appreciate the provocative title. So.
I do too. I also want to say that those conversations are so necessary. I think they're part of what it means to be a scholar and an academic. And I think we have to apprentice our graduate students into those kinds of conversations and make them a part of our practice, which then can also become our praxis.
Yeah,
And
we used to prepare people to go to AERA, the conference, and say like, well, you might have a person in the audience, or you might have a discussant that's not going to say loving things about your project. And we tried to put them in a situation where we asked a few of those questions to prepare them for that. They're like, oh, you're preparing for mean people in the audience? No, that's science. People should feel free to ask tough questions at a research conference. That's why they call it a research conference. But I think sometimes we get so used to, I need to be protective of my students. I don't want them to experience any nervousness or personal attack or anything. It's just research. It's just a paper that you wrote. It's just a project. It didn't come out of your body. It's just something you wrote. And if you can't have people, question it, maybe don't get in the business.
well, and I also think that there's value in having those kinds of critiques and discussions as a way to improve writing and scholarship as well. I know I'm always working on my writing. And part of what makes me a better writer is my writing mentor is not afraid to give me those harder, tougher critiques. And sometimes I have to look at them and say, okay, I got to walk away from this for a while and then come back to it. But then those critiques and also the feedback from reviewers, when I can be open to that, sure, not all feedback from reviewers. I mean, some of it's like, yeah, okay. But really being open to that feedback and being open to it has really made a huge shift in my writing, in my thinking, and my scholarship. And so I think we need to prepare students for that, not in a way that, oh, this is really hurtful to you and or harmful, but in a way that, having these open critiques, having these open dialogues, engaging in this questioning is part of what we do as scholars.
All right, we are just about out of time. So I think we're gonna close on that note. Thank you so much for coming and being controversial and having this discussion with us.
I really appreciate it. Let me just say, Jennifer, that you guys got yourself a good dean there. I've known Cecil for a lot of years and was very happy when he got the job. And if I didn't have kids living in Texas, I'd pick up and I'd come work at SIU if you'd have me just to work for Cecil. So good guy. And thank you so much, everyone, for
checks in the mail, Dan.
conversation.
Checks in the mail.
Have a good day, everyone. Appreciate
Thanks a lot, Dan.